Hello everyone, welcome back one and all, and thank you for joining me here today as we look into another prediction / discussion video on the upcoming patches for Endwalker. Thanks to the last letter from the producer, still kind of recent, we did find out more information about 6.2. We do know that it is going to be coming out sometime in August, and we even have the title for it as Buried Memories. So the title alone is enough to get anyone excited. So, not long ago, I made a video on what I personally believe could have been the possible fate of Ajdaya. So she was the last member of the first brood that we've yet to learn about, and I came up with a very interesting theory about what could have happened to her after she ended up diving into the void. So if you're interested in that, please check out that video if you haven't already. But today we're going to be talking about another character whom we were just introduced to in 6.1, as well as their possible role in the upcoming patches. See, at the end of 6.1, we ran into a very familiar face as our heroes are readying themselves to dive right into the void. Though they haven't officially met in person yet, we did get a brief cutscene where we see a figure, the Knight in Black, within the void, speaking to these 4 elemental specters. We'll just call them the Thrones. But they were discussing about how they had sensed the opening of a void gate, but they weren't particularly worried about that, and instead they mentioned trying to find a way to redeem their world. So, at the sight of the Knight in Black, many a fan freaked out at the sight of it, myself included, because Golbez is such a classic Final Fantasy character that you can't mistake him. For me, Golbez was perhaps the first, I guess, I don't want to say villain, he's the most interesting antagonist that we had when I first started playing this entire series. So Golbez was the first antagonist within the Final Fantasy series that I really was just completely fascinated by, because compared to a lot of the other Final Fantasy villains that we had before now, they were kind of one note. They were kind of that classic evil villain trying to take over the world. Golbez kind of broke that mold. Now, it isn't confirmed by the game or even by Square Enix yet that this is in fact Golbez, but with all the Final Fantasy IV references, as well as this iconic armor, I find it hard to believe that it could be anyone else. Now, I do want to say this real quick, that while this character is definitely Golbez, at least all in our minds he is, there's a very good chance that it's not the same Golbez from Final Fantasy IV. In fact, I'm willing to bet it's not the same. Remember, 14 loves to take references of past games and just kind of incorporate them into the Final Fantasy XIV story. A good example of this would be Gabranth, who was a pretty big enemy from Final Fantasy XII, but he appeared as a very minor role as part of the Garlean Empire. In fact, I don't think we even met him face to face. Or how we have Kryl, who was the main character from 5, but in this version she just joins the Scion as more of a very minor supporting role. So why these characters have a lot of references to previous games, they're not the same characters. So I would say there's a 98% chance that this character is a new version of Golbez within the 14 story, and not the one that we love from 4. Though that would be cool either way. Also, before I go any further, I do want to say that this is going to be a spoiler warning. There's going to be a lot of spoilers for both Endwalker as well for Final Fantasy IV, so please keep that in mind. Now, since you decided to continue watching, I can only assume that you either already know the entire story up to 6.1, as well as the storyline for Final Fantasy IV, or you just don't care. But just in case you forgot about this, let me just give you a quick refresher course on who Golbez and the 4 Archfiends are. I promise it's going to be quick. So, for the basic backstory of Golbez, he was known as the Man in Black in Final Fantasy IV, and he was the secondary antagonist in the game, but he was really the main one that we dealt with for the majority of the story. Throughout most of the storyline, he at first appeared to be this cruel, heartless, cunning manipulator who was tricking our party members multiple times to get these crystals for him or just to lure them into traps. He was revealed near the end of the game to actually be the older brother of the main character, Sissel, and his true name was actually Theodore before he fell under the control of a very powerful Lunarian, or a denizen of the moon, named Xemnas. He kind of took control and manipulated Golbez ever since he was a young child, slowly molding him into the perfect soldier for him as he grew up. While under the influence of Xemnas, Golbez started a quest to gather the crystals, these powerful ones that Golbez used to summon the Giants of Babel and tried to wipe out all humanity. Once he was freed from Xemnas' control, he woke up and his true personality returned to him. And I gotta say, he was horrified by his own actions and he grew to hate himself. Because it turns out his true self was actually much more caring, self-sacrificing, and empathetic than we ever believed possible. Despite all the destruction that he had caused already, Golbez decided that he would lend his strength to the party members and help them defeat Xemnas, which he did end up doing. With his help, they were finally able to put an end to the big boss at the end of the game, and Sissel and his party were free to return to Earth. Golbez, however, decided not to accompany them. He felt that he had no right to be able to do so because of all the damage that he had done. So despite the fact that he was still under Xemnas' control, he decided that he would be better off going to the moon so that he could meet his father's people, feeling that he didn't have a place down on Earth anymore because of all the death that he had caused. Now, Final Fantasy IV has a sequel, The After Years, and we do see Golbez there again. He does return to help Sissel and fights alongside the party members once more, and just depending on who you have in your party at certain moments, that can determine if Golbez either survives or he dies in the game. Either way, this guy was no pushover. He has shown multiple times that he was a force to be reckoned with. During the entire Final Fantasy IV game, he's shown to have very powerful magics. He has teleportation, telepathy, and even some versions of mind control to start off with. Though I think for the mind control part, that was really due more to Xemnas' influence than by Golbez's. He also has really strong resilience, such as how he was basically able to tank a meteor spell from Tella. And not only was he able to withstand the force of that spell, he was able to kind of learn it and steal that particular spell for his own. He also had a very powerful summon of the Shadow Dragon, a powerful creature which almost succeeded in destroying the entire party until Rydia showed up to rescue them. As for the Archfiends, also known as the Elemental Lords, the Four Fiends of the Elements, and even the Four Heavenly Kings, they were also powerful foes that we fought against in Final Fantasy IV, who once served under the controlled Golbez. They were the Blighted Despot, Scarmelione, the Drowned King, Cagnazo, Empress of the Winds, Barbaricha, and the Ocharch of Flame, Rubicante. They were technically minions of Xemnas who placed them under Golbez's commands, and they were generals of his army. They were dispatched one at a time to try and stop Sissel as he was searching for a way to become a paladin. The first of the four fiends we meet is actually Scarmelione, as he was dispatched to Mount Ordeals to kill Sissel since his undead army proved immune to Sissel's dark sword. Thanks to Palom, Polum, and Tella, Sissel was able to defeat him and his zombies, revealing that his true form was actually undead. The next of the four Archfiends that we meet once we return to Baron was Cagnazo, who had killed the king sometime before the start of the game and took his form to basically rule over the kingdom and make it weaker for invasion. Though the party was able to defeat him, the walls of the throne's antechamber then began to collapse, which forced Palom and Polum to petrify themselves to save Sissel and the other members. Later on, while agreeing to exchange the final crystal for Rose's life, they climbed the Tower of Zot to defeat the Mega Sisters, who were minions of Barbaricha, and it was only after Tella unleashed Meteor, which forced Golbez to retreat and Barbaricha appeared in person to be able to fight them, she and the tower both ended up crumbling after her defeat. And finally, for Ruben Conte, he destroyed the kingdom of Amblin, whose survivors were kind of forced to flee to a nearby cave. And Sissel and the party were able to learn that he had moved the crystals to the upper part of the Tower of Babel, and with Edge's help they were able to defeat him as well. Their tales largely end with their defeat, but Zemus does revive them in the Giant of Babel as kind of a last chance to redeem themselves and defeat the party. But once more, they do fail and are destroyed again. Their malice does live on though, and they can be battled as an optional super boss later on, so heads up there. But interestingly enough, the crystals summon the Archfiends from the dead against their will in the After Years sequel, and after you end up fighting and defeating them all again, and they end up dying for, I guess, a third time, they end up thanking the party and show a more, I guess, benign side to them. It was noted that they are as much part of the world as anyone, and maybe even living incarnations of their assigning element. But that at least was never confirmed. But as for Golbez, he's always been such a fascinating character for me, because this is really the first time in one of the Final Fantasy games that we get a truly intimidating enemy, like someone that you really want to hate, but he goes through such character development and such a backstory. It just makes him such a complicated character. Like, you want to hate him, but at the same time you understand him, and you can't really bring yourself to hate him. I mean, we've seen snippets of this in the previous games, but nothing like we had with Golbez. And even though we see this character in other versions of these games, such as in Dissidia, where Golbez is clearly shown to be a clear antagonist, usually up against Sissel, but once we get to know more about him, we see this cunning manipulation where he's actually acting the part of a villain, but he's secretly helping the heroes out the whole time. Golbez is such a delightfully complex antagonist who kind of been forced to walk this dark path since early childhood, because it was really no fault of his own. He was being manipulated, and he just never had a chance to really grow into a person he was always supposed to become. He was molded and shaped by a dark influence into this near villain that we kind of all know and despise, but once he was freed from that influence, we kind of see this new side to him that we actually adore. Like, we understand him, we feel a lot of compassion for him, because in a lot of ways it wasn't his fault. Like, he was forced to do a lot of these really terrible things, but his true self would never have done any of that had he been given a choice. And that's what makes him such an interesting person. In a lot of ways, he's like an innocent child. I mean, he was definitely an innocent child before he was taken over, and once he was finally freed from Zemus's dark influence, it's almost like he was picking up where he left off. So it's almost like we're dealing with a young child's view of the world. The closest way that I can really describe him is like what we got with Yotsuyu and Tsuyu. Tsuyu's true personality kind of got buried underneath all this tragedy and hardship, just one after another, until it left this bitter monster in the form of Yotsuyu. She was a creature born from her environment. But when she was, I guess, suppressed, and the child version of Tsuyu re-emerged, and that's kind of when her true personality did come through, before all of that horrible influence came in and just twisted her to become this monster. Even if it was only temporary, she was able to show us just exactly who she was and what she could have become had fate been kinder to her. Golbez is very much the same way as Yotsuyu in terms of being a tragic character, though he wasn't regressed all the way back down to a child once he was freed. His true self wasn't evil. In fact, he really wasn't given a choice to either be good or evil. It was kind of decided for him, and that, again, is what makes him so interesting. He was a weak-hearted hero that made his brother a better hero. Honestly, I just want to give this man a hug, because I think he really does need one. So that there is the basic story of Golbez and the Archfiends. But what does this have to do with 6.2 and onwards? Well, it's because of this scene at the end of 6.1 where we see the Knight in Black appear before a throne with these four elemental beings, discussing the possibility of redeeming the 13th, or the Void, as they plan for something big. Now, some say that this still could possibly be the same Golbez, but as one who was based on the after years, where that Golbez could either live or die depending on your choices at key moments in the game. So if he survives, he does take the lunar whale and he starts the journey to the other stars and learns the fate of the Lunarians. And after discovering it's possible to do that in the storyline for 14, as well as even travel to other dimensions, well, I guess it's a slim chance, but I highly doubt it. Now, as to where the story is going and to what role that Golbez and the Thrones have from here on out, it's really going to be kind of tricky to decide that. I mean, the Void has been part of the plot ever since A Realm Reborn, though it hasn't played a really big role until now. It is revealed to be one of the 13 reflections of the Source that ended up falling to darkness, and Y'shtola is playing with the idea that learning more about the Void could be the key to being able to travel to the other reflections one day. So I have gone over many different theories as to what this could possibly mean, and I have two different theories that seem to be the most likely possibilities. Again, take from these theories what you will. These are just my personal thoughts, but just let me know what you think of them. Before I get to the idea of the plot, though, I do want to say that, first of all, I believe that the elemental thrones that we saw speaking with Golbez in this cutscene are going to be set up as the new trial fights. Such as how we had the four lords, the warring triad, and the weapons from the previous expansions. The four Archfiends are going to be part of the new trials for Endwalker. Either we're going to be getting all four trials with each one of them, or we have 3 of them plus a final fight with Golbez, and maybe like one of the other fiends will become an instance duty boss or something like that. Kind of like how we had the Sapphire weapon in Shadowbringers. But having said that, let's go on to option 1. So option 1, where we see this cutscene again, and they're talking about in the Void, Golbez mentioned how the Cloud of Darkness was defeated, and he said this line: "'Tis time we set the war in motion and win redemption for our star." So it's long since been theorized that we're going to try to restore the 13th shard after we learn its true nature, and it's something that a lot of fans would love to see happen, myself included. We do know from Vitra's explanation that the Allagons had attempted to summon Voidsent to help them conquer the world here in the Source, but they ultimately failed and their empire became lost and fell to ruin afterwards. As such, it could be that Golbez was thinking that they could have tried to take over the Source, but since they lost the war they started alongside the Allagons, they were never given that chance. So perhaps these 4 elemental thrones served as generals and were about to fully invade the Source, but because of Ashdaya, and she ended up flying through the portal, and I'm guessing she was the one responsible for closing it, and because of that, they weren't able to fulfill their ambitions of taking over a completely new world, one that was filled with ether, which is something that Voidsent feed off of. So this could be their big comeback, as a way to be able to bring either some form of life back into the Void by stealing resources or even gathering up light. We know it has been done. Or they are just trying to find and make for themselves a new home here in the Source where they can gorge themselves on all the ether that they want. I do think that if the Voidsent are trying to escape the Void and go to other worlds, now would be the perfect time to do so with Zodiac gone. This could also be the perfect excuse to be able to cross over to other shards. Because if we have these powerful Voidsent trying to escape not only to the Source, but to the other remaining shards, like maybe we have a way that with every expansion we go to a completely new world, and with every new victory we're slowly returning light to the Void somehow. That way, not only do we end up exploring and saving these different shards, but we're also starting to help restore the 13th at the same time. Again, I highly doubt that part is going to happen, but hey, it's a lot of fun to think about. I honestly don't think that it's going to be that straightforward. I mean, it's easy to just say that the Voidsent are going to be evil and Golbez is fighting for them, then he has to be the bad guy here. I do think that they have something special planned, though. The second theory is that we go to the completely opposite side of that spectrum, in that Golbez is actually trying to save what's left of this world, or maybe even another world, from a new evil force. This could be a very interesting concept because rather than have a clear-cut bad guy, we make things very complex and deep, which we know that 14 loves to do. Perhaps some kind of evil force is posing a new threat to the world of Hydaelyn. Perhaps it comes from the void and it was the main force trying to drown the world in darkness and is trying to repeat that performance here on the source. We could have a Golbez that's aware of this possible threat, and he tries to warn us at first, but then he starts to suspect that maybe we're working with this evil force and he can't trust us. This redemption that he speaks of could be him trying to spare another world from suffering the same fate that befell the 13th. And he's trying to put a stop to this possible evil before it grows out of control. He can serve as the main antagonist throughout the 6.x series, and maybe even through parts of 7.0. But once a greater threat is unmasked, he could transition into a possible ally. Maybe we get our hands on his weapons and armor later on as rewards, for example. As for the Archfiends, they could still play a big role, like how Eden was able to restore Ether back to the empty. Maybe they could play a role in helping to get a start on restoring the void with the elements. Maybe not a whole lot, but at least it would be a place to start. But I really do like the idea that Golbez is aware that another new evil is back and is now a threat to the source and its people. And I can completely see this Golbez as trying to put a stop to this whole thing before it gets out of hand. And I can totally see a storyline being set up on this fact. And it could lead us to maybe some place like Mericidia, to a possible story here in the Void, or even to another reflection. It was stated in an interview that the dev team have made things set up so that with the 6.x series, it's just going to become increasingly complicated and we're not going to have a clear idea where we're going to go to next until the very end. So many right now believe that Golbez is able to summon the Shadow Dragon to fight Sissel and the party in Final Fantasy IV, and especially since we never really got any kind of explanation to what the Shadow Dragon is or where it comes from, it could be that the dragon is Azdaia herself, who plunged into the void thousands of years before. I suppose that could work if they choose to go that route, but I have a lot of faith in the dev team and I do not think that's what's going to happen. Anyone who is a fan of the Final Fantasy IV story, they already know about the Shadow Dragon, and therefore if this Golbez does have a Shadow Dragon, they're going to be expecting it to be Azdaia. And because of that alone, I think that's what leads me to believe to the second option, maybe a little bit more likely. Because Yoshi P and the dev team do love nothing more than to shock and amaze us. And so I do think that while this Golbez is going to be playing a big role in the upcoming patches, maybe even a new expansion, and has some kind of connection to Azdaia, I cannot imagine that things are going to be that simple. They love to go different. They love just kind of all of us making up our own theories about where we're going to go or what's going to happen in the story, and then just kind of tearing that whole idea apart, and they come up with something that no one else has ever thought of. So that's kind of what I expect from the dev team. 6.1, it did go into detail about how resilient that dragon scales are to the Void's corruption, and it's possible that she's still alive and maybe not completely a Void sent yet. If you see my previous video about Azdaia, then I think you already know where I'm going with this particular theory. But there's still that idea that we could end up going to either like Mericidia and maybe have a Mericidia/Void expansion where we ended up learning more about both the dragons and about the Void itself. And as much as I would love to learn about that kind of lore, I can't really bring myself wanting to accept that, especially since we look at how large Mericidia is. And I think that I would want an entire expansion devoted to this land and learning more about it instead of just dividing our attention between here and the Void. As for the idea of a Void expansion, I already made a video on that as a possible storyline as well. And while I would love it if it would be true, at the same time I really don't know if I expect it anymore at this point. Either way, I do think that this would be the most likely of possibilities, that Golbez and the Four Thrones are technically on our side, but they don't know if they can trust us, and therefore they feel like they have to work alone. At the very least, it does seem to be kind of fitting in with Golbez's character that we know and love. Perhaps Golbez will find his new purpose someday in this new storyline for Final Fantasy XIV. But no matter what anyone says, I'm really looking forward to seeing what they have planned with this particular Golbez. Anyway, that's going to be it for right now. Thank you all so much for listening to me ramble on, and I hope that you enjoyed this newest prediction. What do you think? Do you think my theories are possible or not? What are your thoughts on Golbez and the role that he has from here on out? We still have about a month and a half, give or take, before 6.2, and I'm really excited for this patch and how big it's going to be. But until then, I am going to continue to post more lore and prediction videos to keep us entertained. So until next time, everyone, thank you so much for watching. This is Fantasy Girl signing out.